Who is someone everyone thought was crazy but turned out to be right? Write in the comments what you think about it. Who was thought to be falsely insane? Enjoy the show. Story 1, Howard Temin. Throughout the 1970s, a biologist named Howard Temin became convinced that something wasn't right in science's understanding of viruses. His colleagues dismissed him as a heretic. He turned out to be right. Malcolm Gladwell. Temin believed viruses could cause some cancers, even though the scientific community believed this was impossible. Many scientists disregarded his work, but he didn't get discouraged. He persevered until he eventually discovered reverse transcriptase, which allows viral RNA to modify host DNA. This laid the groundwork for researchers to even consider the possibility that AIDS might be caused by a virus, and likely sped up the discovery of HIV by many years. Story 2, I used to work in a mental health facility. We had a long-term patient I'll call Jim. Jim had severe schizophrenia that was only moderately controlled by medication. One night, Jim came to the nurse's station and said there was a snake in his room. Jim was told that there wasn't a snake, and to go back to sleep. He went back to his room. He came back a few times saying the same thing. A while later, a tech was doing hourly rounds. Yup, there was a snake in his room. Oddly enough, not the last time we had a snake in the building. Old building. Story 3, C.Y. O'Connor in Western Australia. He was the engineer and designer for a major water pipeline from a dam 500 kilometers to the inland desert town of Kalgoorlie. It ran over time and over budget. Media and politicians relentlessly attacked him personally as well as the project. He was hounded and mocked. He landed up killing himself before the project's completion. The pipeline works great and is still used. It's absolutely vital for making Kalgoorlie habitable. It was transformative for health and sanitation in the goldfields. I'd originally remembered this as the pipeline being activated but not flowing for ages. So he killed himself amid mockery and ridicule. But he killed himself before it was finished and turned on. For anyone else who was from Western Australia, it was the Sunday Times leading the charge to attack him. Some things apparently never change. Story 4, Alex Jones. Yeah, he messed up a few times, but he was also right about a lot of shit, like a lot. Bohemia Grove, Epstein's Island, 9/11ths, the dad from Seventh Heaven having a spare room in his trailer for drugging girls, the chemical-making frogs, not gay, but actual change their genitalia. Story 5. NASA engineers Roger Boisjoli and Bob Abeling warned that failure of O-rings due to cold weather could cause the Challenger space shuttle to explode, and they refused to sign off on the launch that day. Both engineers' warnings were ignored, and the Challenger disaster occurred on January 28, 1986, resulting in the loss of 7 lives. Story 6. In the mid-19th century, lots of women died after childbirth. A Hungarian obstetrician named Semmelweis watched doctors make rounds of women in labor, and they went from woman to woman, checking the progress of the labor. This was done manually, inserting their hand into the woman's vagina to see how many centimeters dilated they were, from bed to bed. No gloves, no washing of hands. He wondered if that was the cause of the childbirth fever that killed so many new moms. He did a lot of studies and made a lot of experiments, and told doctors to wash their hands between examinations. Many doctors found his ideas absurd, and he died in a mental institution. His insanity could have been brought about by secondary syphilis, but he was also a broken man, often ignored or berated by colleagues. In the 18th century, a Scottish physician, Alexander Gordon, came to a similar idea about the infection killing new mother, and in America, almost simultaneously as Semmelweis, Oliver Wendell Holmes told doctors to wash their hands in the maternity unit. But you asked about someone thought to be crazy. Semmelweis certainly was a bit of a laughingstock amongst his peers, and women died horrible, painful deaths because of that, until the workings of germs and infections became better understood. Story 7. Wilhelm Reich was a Jewish psychoanalyst and scientist who was raised in the Weimar Republic in Germany. He escaped before the Nazis took full power and eventually landed in the U.S., where he was investigated by the FBI for his connection to the Communist Party. The full FBI file on him is available through the Internet Archive and is really funny because they accidentally were investigating a William Reich, which wasted a ton of time and money. Anyways, Reich was pretty much shunned from academia after he became obsessed with his concept of orgone, which he perceived to be a type of bioelectricity that could be harnessed to cure all sorts of ailments, including cancer. He invited Einstein to come view his orgone box and was subsequently labeled a quack and a fraud. Now, decades after he died, bioelectricity is being studied as a legitimate form of sustainable energy, and in recent years, a possible cancer treatment. Story 8. John Cockcroft, eminent English nuclear engineer, demands that sophisticated filters be retrofitted to the exhaust stacks of the Windscale nuclear plant in the UK. This decision was bemoaned as unnecessary, and the filters were even given the pejorative moniker Cockcroft's folly. Cockcroft had a lot of seniority, however, and insisted despite any resistance. The naysayers were laughing out of the other sides of their faces after the Windscale plant caught fire in 1957. The filters dramatically reduced the release of radioactive contamination across the northern UK. Story 9. Barry Goldwater. Mark my word, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe they are acting in the name of God, so they can't and won't compromise. I know, I've tried to deal with them. Story 10. 1. Close to home for me, J. Harlan Bretz. He was a geologist who explored and studied the Badlands of eastern Washington. He was struck by the strange, box-shaped canyons in the area. He posited that they were caused by a massive, violent flood that swept westward to the Pacific Ocean, literally ripping and gouging the canyons out of the landscape. However, at the time, geology was reacting against the idea that catastrophes shaped the landscape. The general understanding of geology at the time was that the landscape only ever changes slowly. Combine the fact that Bretz's theory sounded an awful lot like the biblical flood, and he was ridiculed and sidelined by other members of the profession. We know now that Bretz was correct. At the end of the last ice age, a massive ice dam holding back the massive Lake Missoula broke, and over 100 years or so, it emptied out to the Pacific Ocean with such force that it dug canyons out of the landscape. We've now found granite boulders weighing many tons that match the composition of the Washington bedrock near Spokane as far downstream as Portland, Oregon. I highly recommend the book Bretz's Flood on this topic. Story 11. Xu Xiaodong. From his wiki page, Xu Xiaodong, Chinese Xu Xiaodong, Pinyin Xu Xiaodong, born the 15th of November 1979, is a Chinese mixed martial artist, MMA, who is known for challenging and fighting fraudulent and traditional martial artists. He gained prominence online after he was filmed defeating self-proclaimed Tai Chi master Wei Lei in 2017. Xu has also come to the defense of Fang Fang, a Chinese author living in Wuhan who published the Wuhan Diary, which related the experiences of people living under lockdown in the city by the Chinese government. 37. Fang Fang received widespread criticism from Chinese nationalists, including Tai Chi practitioner Wei Lei, who was defeated by Xu in 2017. Wei called for martial artists in Wuhan to assault Fang for her work, while Xu defended the author who he claims was mild in criticism and was being truthful in her accounts. For us in the West, this sounds like no big deal, but he's been branded a menace in China. Story 12. Frank Fossey, former mayor of Honolulu. He wanted to build a light rail system across the island before Honolulu and Waikiki was what it is now. Then the city could be built up around the mass transit. He got stopped at every attempt. Now, the state government has used up and lost millions of tax funds on the new rail. It's vastly over budget and time. Was supposed to be done 2016. Doesn't run the full planned route. Construction has disrupted traffic and local businesses the entire time. Trying to fit in through downtown in a meaningful way is a huge headache. So yeah, Fossey was right. Should have built it way back then. Story 13. I can only envision the downvotes I'll get from this one, but RFK Jr. was proven correct on all of his predictions about the COVID vaccine. First, they would say it was 95% effective, then slowly walk that down to 20%. First, they would say it protected for life, then walk that down to 2 months. First, they would say you only needed 2 shots, then eventually a booster every season. First, they would say it prevented infection and transmission, etc., etc. It's amazing to me how many people have memory hold all this stuff and now claim that they never said that. I shouldn't have to say this, but I am not generally anti-vax, and despite my skepticism and gut feelings against it, being young and healthy, I did get the jab. A story 14. The third-party option that the news keeps shilling as being completely insane has to be mine. I kept seeing him mentioned in the news and got curious because he seemed to have the most support so far, and I really didn't want to choose between the red and blue teams again. As soon as I started looking into his anti-vax claims after hearing him speak and being surprisingly intellectually stimulating, I did a deep dive trying to understand why he's been reported on this way. I realized all the articles were citing each other in circles, as in I would literally end up on the page I started with originally by clicking their citations. A lot of the things commonly shilled online have no evidence or are actually terrible tragedies being spun into complete myths, like the brain thing or his wife's death, for example. Anytime I was able to track down a primary source of the crazy things he said, I found his well-articulated explanations backed up by historical sources and peer-reviewed studies, all always researchable and incredibly detailed and interesting. Bro is smart as hell, and I guess we're not meant to know that. I mean, if CNN and Fox News are united against someone or something and they share the same shareholders, it's pretty telling, no? Blue and red are pretty good at keeping business as usual when they're in positions of power, regardless of which team it is. I think everything that candidate who must not be named says will end up being true and not a conspiracy, as even some of the things he said months back have been corroborated by public evidence over time. Whenever I listen to him speak, the way the world is makes more sense, not less, and are always traceable to real data. I've learned a lot from him. He used to be an insider, too. He out of anyone would be best at telling it like it is, which I think people are being prevented from realizing. Very easy to dismiss brilliant people by exaggerating their claims just a little bit and deliberately misrepresenting them and calling them conspiratorial. I've certainly learned a lot from following Independent Man's campaign anyways, and implore you, dear reader, might consider doing the same. Story 15, David Lee Roth. When the original Van Halen broke up, everyone just assumed Roth's ego made him impossible to work with. Roth countered these claims by unapologetically claiming the problem isn't him being himself. The problem was someone else, he never named Eddie specifically, wanting to be like him sometimes and then be a family man, devoted husband and father other times. Paraphrasing Roth, you can't go on the road and live the sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle with groupies for 6 months, then come home to the little missus and a white picket fence home in the suburbs the other 6 months a year. You can't be me part-time and Ward Clever the other times. You're going to drink yourself blind and hurt those you love trying to do so. Decades later, we find out Eddie Van Halen was an alcoholic and meth addict for a long time. He was an unfaithful husband that treated Valerie horribly. The only reason he wasn't physically abusive was because his 110 pounds body by meth physique would have got his ass handed to him if he tried. He blamed Roth, Rolling Stone magazine, Warner Brothers promoters, and just everyone else but himself for his problems at home. Story 16 sounds like the plot of every disaster movie from the 70s and 80s. Jaws 1, Jaws 2, Jaws 3, Earthquake, Towering Inferno, Airport, Airport 77, Meteor, and more. Always a threat that nobody sees but the stranger, or outcast who sees it plainly, and the disaster that will be inevitable unless precautions are taken. The mayor or whomever is in charge refuses to take the evasive action because it would cause a loss of income. The disaster happens, lives are lost, and the outcast person is recognized as the unsung hero. I always wonder what if it was more like reality, where the outcast odd person was wrong. What if they listened to the outcast person, lost their millions of dollars, but no disaster happened? Well, no money. No. Story 17. Ignaz Semmelweis, the savior of mothers. He was a physician who believed that childbed fever, the killer of hundreds of new mothers, was caused by physicians not washing their hands. He introduced the idea of antisepsis practices to medicine. He was vilified and mocked, and no one believed him. He was committed to a mental asylum and died as a result of a beating he suffered while there. After his death, he was proven right. Story 18. Christine Collins, famously portrayed by Angelina Jolie in the movie Changeling. After her son was abducted, the police found him months later and reunited them. But Christine was adamant that it wasn't her son Walter and was an imposter. Even though she had evidence to prove it, she was temporarily committed by the officer in charge of the case. And even after the kid admitted he lied and wasn't Walter, it still took over a week to release Christine. Story 19. People warning. Trump wanted to be a dictator. He really does elegant to be a dictator. He said as much himself. He said he's going to punish his enemies, and has said multiple times he's going to do illegal things and nobody is going to stop him. Anyone warning people about Trump in politics has been right. It's been absolutely terrible for the American people. It's torn our country apart, and it's all because of his gross abuse of power, lack of respect for law and order. He's a convicted felon who can't even vote for himself in the coming election, and the only reason any of this works is if the grossly hypocritical evangelical Christo-fascists think they can get what they want from him. Take this warning, it's not over yet. The separation of church and state is crucial to our county's existence. Vote. Story 20, Sir John Cockcroft. Taking advice from a nuclear physicist, he's suggesting adding filters to the cooling tower on the air-cooled Windscale nuclear power plant. He was laughed at, and his project to add the filters became known as Cockcroft's Folly. After much persuasion, they eventually integrated the filters. On October 10, 1957, a fuel rod casing ruptured, and the reactor began melting down. They did basically everything they could to make the problem worse, including trying to blow out the open-air reactor fire by running the cooling fans at max speed, which, as you can imagine, did the exact opposite of putting the fire out. Eventually, they were able to get it under control by shitting off the fans and running water through it for 24 hours. Had those filters not been in place, this would have been a disaster that rivaled Chernobyl. Story 21. Yuri Knorozov was a Russian linguist who in a 1952 paper identified the existence of syllabic signs in Mayan writing, which was a crucial step in deciphering the script. The leading theories on Mayan script at the time believed it to be ideographic meaning. Symbols represent ideas as opposed to being phonetic. J. Eric S. Thompson, the leading Mayan theorist at the time, dismissed Knorozov's theory, and according to one scholar during Thompson's lifetime, it was a rare Maya scholar who dared to contradict him on the value of Knorozov's contributions, or on most other questions. As a result, decipherment of Maya scripts took much longer than their Egyptian or Hittite counterparts, and could only take off after Thompson's demise in 1975. Story 22. Not sure if it's been mentioned, but Nikola Tesla is a great example. He pushed for alternating current, AC, over direct current, DC, which was backed by Thomas Edison. Everyone thought Tesla was out of his mind and that AC was too dangerous and impractical. Turns out, of course, that AC is way more efficient for long-distance power transmission and is now the standard. Tesla's ideas basically laid the foundation for modern electrical systems. Story 23. Phil Oakes was a musician in the 60s and 70s who wrote a lot of anti-government and anti-Vietnam War songs. Towards the end of his life, he scared his friends and family with frequent rants about how the FBI was spying on him. His claims were dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. He killed himself in 1976, and a few years later it was revealed that the FBI had a nearly 500-page file on him. To be fair, he did seem to have some very significant mental health issues, but he was right about the FBI. Story 24. Richard Stallman is the person who started the free software movement, and he's been outspoken about how closed-source software and DRM can and would be weaponized against users. I think that for a long time people agreed with his goals, but didn't really take the risks as seriously as they should have, and a lot of what he warned against has been happening. Unfortunately, as much as he was right about the threat of non-free software and DRM, he's also got a reputation as kind of a creep and weirdo, and his prominence and leadership of the Free Software Foundation probably did more to harm the adoption of free software than all of the corporations and lobbyists together ever could have. His personal reputation have made it difficult to advocate for the ideas he got right because it's quite uncomfortable to be associated with him. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like it, be sure to write comments and share your stories.